They say the desert has a way of exposing everything you try to hide, stripping a soul down to its barest truth beneath the unrelenting sun. That was the hope that had carried Eleanor Hayes out here, far from the tangled remains of her old life in suburban Phoenix, and deep into the rugged, sun-blasted heart of Arizona. She'd left behind the courthouse's echo, the sympathetic stares of coworkers, and the echo of a house suddenly too quiet after the divorce. Her new home, a weathered, slightly lopsided farmhouse a good half-hour from the nearest paved road, sat hunched on the edge of nothing but land and sky, framed by the distant blue smudge of mountains and miles of stubborn sagebrush. Alone but not lonely, or so she kept telling herself, Eleanor pulled on her old hiking boots, packed a dented thermos, and set out into the desert to chase the silence, hoping it would somehow fill her. Hours passed, marked only by the crunch of gravel beneath her feet and the sun's slow climb. The air shimmered with heat, sharp with the scent of creosote and distant rain. As she followed a dry arroyo, her mind wandered, replaying arguments in courtroom voices, sorting through regrets like broken glass. There was no plan, just a need to move, to feel her legs burn and her breath grow ragged, to prove she was not as fragile as everyone seemed to believe. She almost missed the shape in the sand, half hidden behind a brittle tumbleweed, a lump too large and strangely colored to be stone or scrub. It was only when a faint, desperate snort reached her ears that Eleanor stopped, squinting against the glare. There, not 20 yards away, sprawled a wild Mustang mare, her coat a once lustrous dapple gray, now dulled and streaked with sweat, her flanks trembling. The mare's sides rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, her mane tangled with sticks, her eyes wild, rolling whites stark against the dust. Eleanor froze, heart stuttering. Wild horses were legends out here, seen in flickers at dawn, never up close, and certainly never like this. She inched closer, voice barely above a whisper. Easy now. But her words vanished in the wind. The mare tried to rise, hooves scrambling, but crumpled again with a sound that cut deeper than any memory of her own heartbreak. And then Eleanor saw the telltale swell of the mare's belly, sides stretched tight, nostrils flaring with the effort of two lives struggling to survive. The wild Mustang was pregnant and dying, far from her herd. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to Eleanor, the dying mare, and the vast emptiness pressing in. Instinct warred with fear. Every sensible bone in her body screamed to leave. But she couldn't. Maybe it was the way the horse's eyes pleaded, or maybe it was a stubborn, reckless need to prove she could still save something, even if she couldn't save her marriage. Without thinking, she dropped her backpack, pulled off her scarf, and unwound the belt from her jeans. Her hands shook as she knotted them into a makeshift lead, heart hammering in her chest. She spoke softly, not knowing if the words meant anything to the animal, but needing to say them all the same. Minutes blurred as Eleanor maneuvered closer, flinching at the occasional wild kick, but never backing away. Sweat stung her eyes, grit stuck to her lips, but she kept going, inch by inch, looping the makeshift rope around the mare's neck, careful not to startle her. At first, the mare resisted, fear and pain mingling in her gaze, but Eleanor's persistence paid off. With the gentlest pull and a low, steady voice, she coaxed the Mustang to her feet, unsteady, trembling, but upright. The desert, of course, was not about to make things easy. As Eleanor and the mare staggered toward the distant shimmer of her pickup, a sharp, keening cry split the silence. Coyotes. She could see them now, 3, maybe 4, gray shapes flickering among the rocks, eyes locked on the wounded mare. Panic surged, but Eleanor forced herself to think. She grabbed a handful of stones, hurling them with all her might, shouting until her voice broke, dust billowing with each frantic throw. The coyotes paused, sizing up this strange, desperate human, and then slunk back, but not far. There was no path, only instinct and desperation. Every step was a struggle, the mare faltering, Eleanor's muscles screaming with effort. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery reds. Just as the battered pair neared the battered old Chevy, a sudden gust whipped up a cloud of sand, blinding and fierce. A desert sandstorm, quick and cruel. Eleanor clung to the mare, ducking her head, feeling grit sting her skin, unable to see more than a foot ahead. For long, disorienting minutes, they staggered blindly. Eleanor's world reduced to the trembling body beside her and the rasp of her own breath. When the wind finally died, the world reappeared, strangely hushed, the air washed clean. The coyotes were gone. Eleanor, blinking through tears and dust, realized they'd made it. With the last of her strength, she coaxed the mare into the bed of the truck, improvising a ramp from a fallen fence plank. Collapsing into the driver's seat, Eleanor looked back at the wild horse, battered but alive, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem quite so empty. As she started the engine and turned toward home, Eleanor glanced at the mare and thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the things we rescue end up saving us right back. The drive home felt endless, every jolt of the battered pickup a new test of Eleanor's resolve. The Arizona sun had faded to dusk, painting the desert in bruised purples and deepening shadows. Dust streamed through open windows, and every so often, Eleanor looked in the rearview mirror to catch a glimpse of the Mustang, so impossibly wild and fragile, legs folded beneath her, breathing ragged. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles pale as bone, mind racing with plans and worries. Every mile put them farther from the safety of the herd and closer to whatever fragile hope she could offer. Back at the farmhouse, dusk had deepened into night. The old barn loomed in the headlights, faded red planks, the scent of hay and old wood greeting Eleanor as she stepped out. She could hear the wind moving through the saguaros, the low moan of distant coyotes, reminders that the desert never really slept. There was no time to hesitate. Eleanor moved quickly, searching the yard for anything useful. A faded tarp, half-rotten boards, the stubborn length of baling wire she'd nearly tossed last week. Everything became a tool, every moment a race against the night. The mare, half carried and half coaxed down the makeshift ramp, stumbled in the dark, flanks heaving, but Eleanor's steady hands and whispered encouragement kept her moving. She led the Mustang into the barn, dust swirling, loose straw crunching underfoot, and settled her onto a thick pile of hay in a rickety stall. A single bare bulb cast harsh shadows, flickering slightly, painting the mare's gray coat with streaks of gold and darkness. Eleanor's breath clouded in the cool barn air. For a moment, she just stood there, watching the mare, the silence settling heavy around them. As she worked, Eleanor's mind raced with memories of her mother's gentle hands tending to injured birds, her own childhood spent coaxing stray cats out from under porches. But a wild Mustang, pregnant and half-starved, was another thing entirely. The stakes were higher, the fear sharper. Her hands shook as she filled an old bucket with water, grabbed a battered feed scoop, and fetched what little grain she could find in the shed. The mare sniffed at the offerings, flared nostrils testing the air, then drank greedily, lips trembling. Every mouthful felt like a small victory. The sound of distant coyotes pulled Eleanor back to reality. She hurried to drag the heaviest things she could find, an old wheelbarrow, a rusty feed trough, across the barn door, creating a crude barrier. It would have to be enough for tonight. She paused, listening to the silence, broken only by the mare's steady breathing and the occasional thud of a restless hoof. Suddenly, a harsh cry shattered the quiet, the unmistakable yip of coyotes, closer now, emboldened by darkness. Eleanor grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding. She caught the glint of eyes along the fence line, 4 or 5 pairs, ghostly shapes weaving through mesquite and shadow. Her throat tightened, but she refused to back down. Snatching up a heavy rock, she hurled it with all her strength, then another, her voice rising above the wind in a raw shout. The coyotes scattered, melting into the dark, but Eleanor knew they would return. Back inside the barn, the Mustang shivered, eyes wide with fear and pain. Eleanor moved to her side, speaking softly, hands moving with awkward gentleness. She ran her fingers along the mare's sweat-soaked neck, feeling the tremor of exhausted muscles. There was so much she didn't know, so much that could go wrong. The responsibility weighed on her, a leaden ache beneath her ribs. She thought about calling for help, but remembered the long drive to town, the patchy cell signal, the way everyone in this county seemed to mind their own business. She was on her own. Improvisation became survival. Eleanor tore up an old sheet for bandages, cobbled together a halter from rope and knots she half remembered from Girl Scouts. Every task was a struggle, but failure wasn't an option, not with 2 lives hanging in the balance. Sweat ran down her temples as she worked, the barn air thick with the smell of dust and fear. Through it all, the Mustang watched her, wild eyes slowly softening, as if weighing whether this strange human might be trustworthy after all. It wasn't just coyotes that threatened. As the night dragged on, a storm brewed on the horizon, low rumbles of thunder, the sharp tang of ozone. Eleanor worked faster, reinforcing the stall, gathering buckets in case the roof leaked. The Mustang's breathing grew shallow, sweat darkening her coat. Lightning flickered in the distance, each flash revealing a little more of the wild terror in those deep, liquid eyes. As wind rattled the barn doors and rain began to drum against the tin roof, Eleanor pressed on, driven by a stubborn mix of fear and hope. She thought of the desert, of how easily life was swallowed by its endless expanse, how survival here was a defiant act. Every moment with the Mustang was borrowed time, every small gesture an act of faith. By midnight, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Yet Eleanor forced herself to her feet again and again, checking on the mare, whispering nonsense just to fill the silence. She felt a flicker of pride. No one else would ever know what she'd risked, or how close she'd come to giving up, but it didn't matter. Tonight, in the heart of the desert, she had chosen courage over comfort, compassion over fear. And as the rain hammered down and the wild Mustang slept at last, Eleanor realized she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Night in the desert was nothing like Eleanor remembered. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by the shivering glow of the single barn bulb and the steady rhythm of rain on tin. Every sound was amplified, the wind whistling through broken slats, the restless shift of the Mustang's hooves, the distant rumble of thunder echoing across miles of empty land. Sleep felt impossible, Swept away by adrenaline and worry, but exhaustion clung to Eleanor's shoulders as she worked through the long hours. She moved quietly, almost reverently, around the makeshift stall, tending to the wild mare who had somehow survived the journey home. The animal's breathing was shallow, eyes rolling in the low light, nostrils flaring at every unfamiliar scent. Eleanor felt out of her depth, navigating by memory and hope. She dragged a battered old library book from her backpack, Field Guide to Equine First Aid, and thumbed through pages by flashlight, searching for answers in dry black print. The book's advice was clinical, almost cold. Keep the animal calm, monitor for signs of distress, provide fresh water, avoid sudden movements. Simple on paper, impossible in practice. Her hands shook as she filled a bucket and offered it, holding her breath. For a long moment, the Mustang ignored her, head turned away, eyes wary. But finally, trembling, the mare dipped her muzzle into the water and drank. It was a small victory, but Eleanor let herself breathe. She stayed beside the animal for hours, coaxing her to sip and rest, whispering comfort into the dark, even as the horse's body trembled with pain and fear. Eleanor thought of her old life, a classroom filled with bright faces, a kitchen filled with laughter, a future she'd once believed in. All of it felt impossibly far away, like someone else's dream. When the rain eased and the wind grew softer, Eleanor made a bed for herself out of hay bales just outside the stall, wrapped in an old quilt. She listened to the storm's dying breath, the creak of rafters, the slow settling of the barn. But sleep wouldn't come. Doubt gnawed at her. She replayed every step of the day. Had she made things worse by interfering? Should she have called for help? Would the mare survive the night? Each question felt like a weight pressing on her chest, stealing her breath. Restlessness took hold. Again and again, Eleanor rose to check the mare, shining her flashlight over trembling flanks and labored sides. The animal's eyes followed her, no longer wild with terror, but still wary, measuring her intent. When the mare shifted and whimpered, Eleanor stroked her neck with gentle, hesitant hands, murmuring encouragement, half for herself, half for the horse. Hours blurred together in the cold, dusty darkness, an endless cycle of checking, tending, waiting. Time stretched and twisted. At one point she thought she heard the distant yip of coyotes, but it faded into silence. The loneliness was sharper than ever, but it was laced with something new, a sense of responsibility, a flicker of purpose that had been missing for so long. Eleanor remembered stories of frontier women, legends who braved the wild and carved out lives with nothing but grit and hope. She wondered what they would make of her, crouched in the straw, clutching a library book and talking to a half-wild horse in the dead of night. As the first edge of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, the storm finally broke. Pale light filtered in, blue and ghostly, revealing the dust swirling in the air and the silver sheen of sweat on the mare's coat. Eleanor rubbed her eyes and watched as the Mustang finally seemed to relax, eyelids drooping, sides moving with slow, steady breaths. For the first time, the animal did not flinch at her touch. The tension eased, if only a little. Exhausted but relieved, Eleanor reached for her phone, its battery flashing red. She dialed the number of the local veterinarian, reciting her worries in a whisper. The vet's voice on the other end was calm, almost soothing, reminding Eleanor to keep the animal warm and hydrated, to watch for signs of labor, to call again if things turned worse. She scribbled notes on the back of a feed bag, fingers numb, mind swimming with anxiety and hope. As the morning sun rose, painting the barn in golden light, Eleanor felt a shift in the air. She knew the battle wasn't over. The mare, whom she'd begun to call Willow in her mind, for the way she bent without breaking, still faced a long road ahead. But as Eleanor watched Willow lift her head and look at her, something wordless passed between them. A flicker of trust, fragile but real, like the first green shoot after a storm. The night had been long, filled with doubt and fear, but it had changed them both. Eleanor felt it in her bones, a sense of belonging, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She stroked Willow's neck one last time before stepping outside to greet the day, the desert stretching out before her, wild and uncertain, but now just a little less lonely. The desert morning began with a deceptive calm. Pale sunlight stretched across the horizon, glinting off rain-soaked sand and distant mountain ridges. In the barn, the air was thick with the earthy scent of damp straw and the faint tang of sweat and fear. Eleanor had hardly slept, haunted by worry and the restless movements of the Mustang she now called Willow. As dawn brightened, Willow grew increasingly agitated, shifting her weight, pawing at the ground, and tossing her head with a new, urgent restlessness. Outside, the quiet was already unraveling. Dark clouds gathered on the distant edge of the sky, rolling in heavy and fast, their blue-black bellies swollen with a promise of more rain. The radio, flickering with static in the kitchen, had warned of severe weather, a rare late-spring storm barreling in from the mountains. But inside the barn, Eleanor's focus was fixed on Willow, every sense tuned to the rising tension that filled the air. Willow's sides heaved with each breath, her eyes wild and glossy. The first drops of rain began to rattle the tin roof, and Eleanor's heart hammered as she watched the signs she'd memorized from library books and frantic phone calls. The time had come. Labor. The knowledge hit her with an icy jolt. She moved quickly, gathering towels, buckets, and every scrap of courage she had left. Lightning forked on the horizon, thunder rolling closer, rattling the glass in the barn's small windows. The storm broke in earnest just as Willow's ordeal began. Rain lashed the walls, wind howled through the eaves, and the barn trembled with the force of the tempest. Shadows leapt and twisted in the flickering lamplight as Eleanor knelt beside the mare, her hands shaking but steady, determined to see this through. She talked softly, voice barely audible over the roar outside, not to comfort Willow, who was lost to her own struggle, but to steady herself. Every minute felt impossibly long, drawn out by anxiety and adrenaline. Willow strained, her powerful body racked with pain, muscles taut beneath her dapple gray coat. Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow, recalling every detail the veterinarian had described. Stay calm. Watch for complications. Help if you must, but do not panic. Easy to recite, nearly impossible to follow. Her hands trembled, yet she forced herself to stay collected, gathering clean towels, clearing the straw, lighting another lantern as the barn lights flickered under the storm's assault. Time lost all meaning. Thunder rattled the rafters. The storm was a living thing, battering the world beyond their fragile shelter. Willow collapsed on her side, nostrils flaring, sides heaving in rhythm with each contraction. Eleanor reached for her phone, hands clumsy with fear, and called the veterinarian. Rain pounded on the tin roof, drowning out half the conversation, but the instructions came through, steady and precise. Stay with her. If the foal does not breathe, clear its nostrils, rub its body, do not give up. A final, Desperate push, and the foal arrived, limp, slick, and terrifyingly still. For an instant, everything stopped. The storm outside faded. Eleanor saw only the fragile new life sprawled in the straw, eyes closed, chest unmoving. Panic clawed at her throat, but she moved on instinct, following the vet's distant voice still echoing in her ear. She cleared the foal's nostrils with her sleeve, rubbing its sides, pressing her trembling hands along its ribs, willing it to breathe. Lightning split the sky. The barn ablaze in ghostly white for a heartbeat. Then darkness. Time stretched. The foal remained still, no breath stirring its wet, matted coat. Eleanor's heart thudded painfully as she rubbed harder, tears stinging her eyes, the storm's howl all around her. She remembered the vet's final words, "Do not give up." So she pressed on, her whole being focused on this tiny, silent Mustang. A gasp, a flutter of movement, so faint she almost missed it. Then another. The foal's sides shuddered. A weak, shuddering breath escaped its lips. Relief crashed over Eleanor, raw and overwhelming. She cradled the tiny creature in her arms, whispering nonsense, laughing and crying as thunder boomed outside. She named him Sable for the darkness of his wet, newborn coat and the strength he'd shown in those impossible first moments. The worst had passed, but the night was far from over. Willow, exhausted but alert, reached for her foal, nuzzling him with trembling lips. Eleanor stepped back, giving them space, heart pounding with pride and fear. The barn was filled with the smell of birth and rain, the electric crackle of the storm still dancing across the fields. But inside, beneath the flickering glow of a single lantern, life had triumphed. Against the odds, mother and foal were together, alive. Eleanor slumped to the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, watching as Willow licked her new son, coaxing him to his feet. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling away into the distance, leaving behind a hush so profound it felt sacred. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. She was no longer just a bystander in the desert, no longer defined by loss or loneliness. She had fought for life, and in that fight, she discovered a courage she never knew she had. Morning in the desert arrived with a hush, the world still damp from the night's storm. The air washed clean and tinged with a faint scent of sage. Inside the barn, Eleanor barely noticed the sunrise. She moved slowly, her body aching from sleepless hours, but her mind buzzing with new purpose. Willow and Sable, both alive, both fragile, depended on her now. That knowledge eclipsed everything else. She knelt beside the makeshift stall, eyes red-rimmed and heavy, but careful as she cleaned the straw, replaced water, and checked the foal's tiny, uncertain breaths. Sable lay curled at Willow's side, ribs fluttering with every inhale. He seemed impossibly small against his mother's bulk, a trembling question mark of a horse. But he was alive, and so was Willow. Eleanor allowed herself a faint smile, a private triumph as she watched the mare gently nudge her foal, encouraging him to stand. That first morning set the tone for the days that followed. Eleanor's life narrowed to the rhythms of care. Feeding, cleaning, watching, guarding. She read every pamphlet and library book she could find, her phone a lifeline to the veterinarian miles away. The house itself faded into the background. She lived mostly in the barn now, moving between stall and corral, her every waking thought circling the fragile bond she was building with these two wild creatures. Sable's first attempts at standing were clumsy, all knobby knees and trembling legs. Eleanor watched, heart in her throat, as Willow nickered softly, her nose nudging Sable's flank, urging him up. Each time the foal collapsed, Eleanor winced, but Willow showed no frustration, only relentless, patient encouragement. After hours of effort, Sable managed to rise, tottering on spindly legs, swaying dangerously but upright. Eleanor caught her breath, pressing a hand to her chest as a surge of hope bloomed inside her. The desert had a way of breaking things down, but sometimes it gave back too, if you fought hard enough. Willow's wounds required constant attention. Eleanor cleaned the scrapes and bites with saline, her movements slow and deliberate, whispering reassurance as she worked. The mare still startled at sudden sounds, wild eyes darting, but she no longer shied away from Eleanor's touch. Trust grew slowly, woven through long hours and quiet gestures. An apple sliced and offered palm up, a bucket of cool water placed just so. The steady, soothing presence of a woman determined not to give up. Sable watched everything with wide, dark eyes, imprinting the world in silence. The threat of predators never left Eleanor's mind. One morning, while gathering firewood near the edge of her property, she spotted mountain lion tracks, fresh, sharp imprints in the wet earth. The realization sent a cold prickle down her spine. The barn, she knew, was sturdy but hardly a fortress. That night, she slept lightly, the sound of every snapping twig and distant yip keeping her alert. She fortified the doors with scrap lumber, set up tin cans on strings to rattle at the slightest disturbance, and kept the old rifle her father had left her close at hand, though she hoped never to use it. She built a small corral from scavenged wood and stubborn determination. The structure was rough, crooked rails and mismatched boards, but it provided Willow and Sable a safe place to stretch their legs, to bask in the desert sun by day and huddle close at night. It became a symbol of Eleanor's own recovery, a project that gave her hands purpose and her mind peace, however fleeting. Days slipped into one another, marked by small victories and relentless work. Sable gained strength, his steps growing surer, his coat losing the wet, matted look of a newborn. Willow began to trust, following Eleanor's movements with calm curiosity rather than panic. Sometimes, in the quiet before dusk, Eleanor would stand by the fence, watching mother and foal graze beneath the endless Arizona sky. The silence between them was companionable, filled with the subtle music of horses breathing, crickets singing, wind rustling through mesquite. Eleanor's loneliness eased, replaced by a new sense of belonging. She began to talk to Willow and Sable, not out of necessity, but as if they were old friends, confidants in her strange, hard-won sanctuary. She found herself telling them stories, sometimes about her students back in Phoenix, sometimes about the ache of divorce, sometimes just about the shape of the clouds overhead. In the presence of these two wild creatures, she found a peace that had eluded her for years. But life in the desert was never simple. One afternoon, as Eleanor repaired a section of corral fencing, she caught sight of movement on the ridge beyond her property, a flash of tawny fur, the slink of a predator pausing to watch. Her heart leapt into her throat. She dropped her hammer, racing back to the barn, counting hoofbeats and breaths, ensuring both Willow and Sable were safe inside. That night, she set a lantern burning bright, hoping the light would keep danger at bay. Yet even with the ever-present threat, a quiet joy had begun to grow. Eleanor realized that for the first time in months, she woke each morning with a sense of anticipation, a purpose that reached beyond her own hurt. In saving Willow and Sable, she was saving herself, a piece at a time, as fragile and miraculous as new life in the storm-washed desert. Summer's heat returned with a vengeance, settling over the Arizona desert like a heavy blanket, drawing waves of shimmer from the ochre ground and drying the world to a hard, brittle edge. The air inside the barn became thick and stifling by midday, pushing Eleanor and her charges outside beneath the sparse shade of the corral's mesquite branches. Each morning began with chores, filling buckets, checking fences, scanning for tracks, but Eleanor sensed a shift in the rhythm. The wildness in Willow was stirring again. Days had passed since the storm and the foal's birth, but something in the Mustang had changed. Willow's wounds healed and her strength returned, but so did her restlessness. She paced the corral's perimeter, pausing at the far end where the fence met open land, nose raised to the wind, nostrils wide as if she were searching for a familiar scent. Sometimes, in the gold light before sunset, Willow stood frozen and alert, staring beyond the property toward the unbroken horizon. Sable, still gangly and unsure, stayed close to her side, mimicking her every movement. Eleanor watched, feeling both pride and a hollow ache that grew deeper by the day. Despite all her efforts, the careful feedings, the nights on the barn floor, the constant vigilance, Eleanor couldn't escape the feeling that Willow was not meant for this life behind rails and gates. The Mustang's eyes had softened toward her, filled with something like trust, but the untamed fire remained. It was clearest when the wind carried distant sounds, the echo of hoofbeats, the sharp call of a hawk, the subtle, ancient music of the wild. Willow would lift her head, muscles tense, and Eleanor knew she was listening to a world Eleanor could never fully understand. Eleanor's own world had changed too. The routine she'd built, so necessary in the early days, began to feel both comforting and confining. She'd started to imagine what would happen when, if, Willow and Sable were truly ready to leave. The thought brought a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of inevitability. She had always known, deep down, that she was only a caretaker, a brief and imperfect bridge between wildness and safety. One morning, as Eleanor repaired the corral gate, a battered blue pickup rumbled up the dusty driveway, sending a spiral of dust into the clear sky. She wiped sweat from her brow, wary but curious, as the truck door creaked open and an old man stepped out. He wore a battered hat and a sun-faded shirt, his face seamed by decades of desert wind. He tipped his hat in greeting and introduced himself as Mr. Tucker, her nearest neighbor, though he lived several miles away on the far side of a dry arroyo. Mr. Tucker had heard about her rescue project from the feed store in town. He walked the fence line with Eleanor, boots crunching on gravel, listening as she described the ordeal, the storm, the birth, the stubbornness and will of both mother and foal. He nodded along, eyes thoughtful, and shared his own stories of wild horses and desert survival. But it was his news that made Eleanor's heart quicken. There'd been a band of Mustangs spotted out near the old mining trail, a stallion and several mares, ranging close to the same hills where Eleanor had found Willow. Tucker described the telltale tracks, the shifting dust, the fleeting glimpses of wild bodies at dawn. He spoke with the measured certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching the land change and endure. As he finished, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, a heavy, aching clarity. The signs were all there. Willow's unease, her constant longing for the horizon, her restless pacing at sunset. She wasn't just recovering, she was searching. The wild was calling her home, That evening, Eleanor sat beside the corral, the last rays of sunlight striping the dirt with fire. Willow and Sable grazed in silence, framed by the immense sweep of desert and sky. Eleanor watched them, her heart tangled in hope and sorrow. She wanted to keep them safe, to hold on to the rare sense of belonging they'd brought her. But she knew the truth. True love, true compassion, was not about possession. It was about release. The lesson was sharp but clear. To love a wild thing was to let it be wild. She stayed outside until the stars emerged, pricking the darkness with cold fire, and listened to the quiet sounds of Willow and Sable breathing, the hush of the desert at night. In the stillness, she found a strange kind of peace, a surrender to something bigger than her own fear. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, a plan to form, a journey to risk. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself to simply be, caretaker, witness, and, at last, friend to the wild. Eleanor rose before dawn. The air still cool, the desert painted in indigo and lavender. She moved quietly through her morning routine, nerves humming beneath her skin as she filled water bottles, checked supplies, and triple-checked the borrowed trailer hitched to her truck. Her hands moved by memory, but her thoughts were fixed on the task ahead. Today, Willow and Sable would begin their journey back to the wild. She found Willow already awake, standing at the corral's edge, Sable pressed close to her side. Both horses seemed to sense that something was changing. Willow's eyes were bright, and her ears flicked with anticipation and anxiety. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat, running her hands gently over Willow's neck, lingering for a moment, as if to memorize the feel of warm, living muscle beneath her fingers. Mr. Tucker arrived just as the first golden rays touched the barn's roof. He greeted Eleanor with a nod, his presence quiet and steady. The comfort of a man used to wide distances and hard decisions. Together, they worked in silence, guiding Willow and Sable into the trailer. It wasn't easy. Willow's wildness flared at the smell of metal and the clatter of hooves on aluminum. But patience, and the calming presence of Sable, finally persuaded her in. The process left Eleanor breathless, heart pounding, sweat prickling her brow even in the chill morning air. They set out as the sun crested the horizon, the truck rumbling down the dusty track, the trailer swaying behind. The desert opened before them, endless and ancient, scattered with twisted Joshua trees and the silent bones of long-abandoned ranches. Eleanor drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes searching the road for ruts and washouts, mind racing with the memory of every warning the vet and Mr. Tucker had offered. Watch for overheating. Keep them calm. Never force them onward if they panic. The first few hours passed in tense quiet. Mr. Tucker rode beside her, map spread across his knees, occasionally pointing out the barely visible trails and landmarks that would guide them toward the old mining country. Conversation was sparse, replaced by the hum of tires, the rattle of supplies, and the intermittent whinny from the trailer behind. By midday, they reached a dried-up creek bed, a ribbon of pale stones and scorched earth, marked by the prints of coyotes and jackrabbits. Eleanor parked beneath a rare outcrop of shade. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the creak of metal and the distant trill of cicadas. Together, they unloaded Willow and Sable, giving them a chance to drink, to stretch their legs, to graze on tufts of stubborn desert grass. Sable staggered at first, unsteady after hours in the trailer, but Willow stood tall and alert, head lifted to catch every faint sound on the wind. Eleanor watched them, her heart aching with pride and fear. She remembered her first days in the desert, how every shadow had felt like a threat, every decision fraught with doubt. Now the land felt different. The desert had become familiar, its silence less intimidating, its vastness a kind of comfort. She realized she'd changed too. The woman who had once run from loneliness was now guiding two wild creatures back toward the freedom they deserved. They rested through the hottest hours, waiting out the harsh sun. Mr. Tucker brewed coffee over a small fire, his movements unhurried and sure. Eleanor sat with her back against a weathered boulder, watching the shadows grow and the sky deepen toward evening. When the worst of the heat had passed, they loaded the horses once more and pressed onward. The next stretch was harder. Roads gave way to rutted trails, then to little more than memory and hope. Willow grew restless in the trailer, kicking and pawing at the floor with each turn. The truck bounced and groaned over rocks and gullies, every jolt testing Eleanor's resolve. She drove slowly, stopping often to check the horses, to offer water and reassurance, to scan the horizon for signs of the Mustang herd they sought. That night, they camped beside another dry creek, the world silent except for the occasional distant bark of a coyote and the gentle sound of Willow's breath. Eleanor lay awake on her bedroll beneath the stars, exhaustion tangled with hope and worry. She listened to the night, the calls of owls, the shifting of horses nearby, the rustle of Mr. Tucker's blanket as he turned in his sleep. She realized she was more at peace out here, beneath the open sky, than she had ever been in her empty house. At dawn, she rose, shoulders stiff but heart steady. Today, they would follow the Mustang tracks Tucker had found at the last waterhole. Faint imprints that spoke of wild hooves and a life that belonged to the open. With every mile, they grew closer to the edge of what could be held and what must be set free. The journey was far from over, but Eleanor was no longer afraid. She pressed forward, guided by the promise she'd made to Willow, and quietly, to herself. The morning began with a restless hush. Eleanor woke before sunrise, the air heavy with anticipation, the vast silence broken only by the sound of Willow and Sable shifting in their makeshift corral. Mr. Tucker was already up, packing away his bedroll, moving with practiced efficiency. They broke camp quickly, both sensing that today would bring more than the simple challenges of rough roads and wary horses. The tracks they'd followed the night before, fresh, deep hoofprints and the scuff marks of a herd's passing, led them into a canyon where the cliffs threw deep shadows and the air seemed to hold its breath. The drive grew slow and treacherous. The path was little more than a suggestion, a twisting, rock-strewn trail bordered by juniper and the skeletons of old mining shacks. Eleanor's grip tightened on the wheel, every jolt echoing through her bones. The truck and trailer edged forward inch by inch, until even the sound of their progress was swallowed by the canyon walls. As they rounded a bend, Mr. Tucker signaled for her to stop, raising a hand in silent warning. Eleanor followed his gaze. Two figures stood ahead, barely visible in the morning light. A pair of men by a pickup truck, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their posture was casual, but their eyes swept the landscape with intent. The sight sent a cold chill down Eleanor's spine. She'd heard stories in town of poachers, men who tracked wild horses for profit, indifferent to the law or the pain they left behind. She parked the truck at a distance, heart racing, and the world seemed to narrow to the ticking of the engine and the steady rise and fall of her own breath. Willow and Sable shifted uneasily in the trailer, as if they too sensed the change in the air. Mr. Tucker studied the men, his jaw set. He leaned in close to Eleanor, voice a whisper, and pointed out the best route for slipping the Mustangs through the canyon unnoticed, a narrow ravine half hidden by a stand of mesquite. But the poachers blocked the main trail, and there was no way to move the horses past them without being seen. Fear twisted in Eleanor's stomach, but something fiercer, determination, maybe even anger, flared up and refused to back down. She weighed her options, searching for something she could use. Her gaze fell to the battered key fob in her hand, the old truck's alarm system, barely used, but just loud enough to draw attention. The plan formed in an instant, desperate and wild. Mr. Tucker would quietly lead Willow and Sable along the ravine while she created a distraction. She slipped from the cab, moving low, circling around the truck and doubling back toward the trailhead. With a deep breath, she pressed the alarm. The truck erupted in a piercing shriek, the horn blaring, echoing off the canyon walls. At the same moment, Eleanor started the engine and floored the gas pedal, spinning the wheels and sending up a blinding cloud of dust and gravel. The poachers shouted, swinging their rifles up in confusion, sprinting toward the noise. Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched them disappear in the cloud, drawn by the chaos she'd created. All the while, Mr. Tucker moved with silent purpose, guiding the frightened Mustangs down the hidden ravine, coaxing them forward with gentle persistence. Willow, as if sensing the danger, moved quickly and quietly, Sable close at her flank. The distraction gave them just enough time. As the dust began to settle and the poachers realized the ruse, Mr. Tucker had nearly reached the far side of the canyon with the horses. Eleanor saw the flash of movement as one man doubled back, cursing, and she pressed the horn again, driving in circles, anything to keep their attention fixed on her. The tension was electric, a thin, dangerous line that threatened to snap with every passing second. Finally, Mr. Tucker emerged from the ravine, waving her on. Eleanor released the alarm, turned the truck, and sped away, the sound of angry shouts fading behind her. She circled around, parking a safe distance away from the main trail, heart still hammering in her chest. She sprinted to where Mr. Tucker waited, Willow and Sable hidden behind the thick brush, both horses trembling but safe. For a few moments, the world was silent except for the sound of their breath, the distant call of a hawk overhead, the endless hush of wind through the canyon. Eleanor's hands shook as she touched Willow's neck, feeling the wild pulse beneath the skin, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. The poachers, fooled and frustrated, searched the empty canyon, their curses carried away by the wind. In the ravine, Eleanor and Mr. Tucker waited, barely daring to breathe, until at last the threat had passed and the men moved on, defeated by dust and determination. The relief was overwhelming. Eleanor slumped against a boulder, chest heaving, watching as Willow nuzzled Sable. The two Mustangs pressed close together, unbroken by fear. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, finding the herd, reuniting mother and foal with their own kind. But in that moment, courage tasted real on her tongue, and hope burned bright in the cool canyon air. Dust still hung in the air as Eleanor crouched behind a scraggly mesquite, her heart thudding in her chest. The poachers' angry shouts echoed through the canyon, fading as they stomped away, defeated for now, but surely not gone. Eleanor scanned the ravine where Willow and Sable stood with Mr. Tucker, the Mustangs' coats streaked with sweat and dust. Their eyes wide and wary, the morning sun crept higher, throwing hard-edged shadows along the rocks. painting the landscape in contrasts as sharp as the emotions surging through her. They waited in silence, breaths held, until the last echo of the poachers' voices faded into the far reaches of the canyon. Only then did Eleanor emerge, muscles trembling, adrenaline still pulsing in her veins. She brushed the dirt from her jeans, met Mr. Tucker's solemn nod, and turned her attention to Willow and Sable. The horses stood close together, Willow's body angled protectively in front of her foal. Sable pressed against his mother's side, head low, but curiosity flickered in his gaze as he watched Eleanor approach. She took a moment to steady herself, then reached for Willow's halter, feeling the soft warmth of the Mustang's breath on her palm. The world seemed to shrink to this small circle of life: 2 horses, 2 humans, and a vast wilderness still echoing with the threat they'd just escaped. The urge to gather Willow and Sable close, to protect them from everything outside this hidden pocket of safety, pulsed through Eleanor. But she knew what had to happen next. Mr. Tucker stepped forward, voice low and steady, and pointed out a series of faint hoofprints that led up a slope toward a narrow ridge. Fresh, unshod, unmistakably Mustang. Eleanor's chest tightened with hope and dread in equal measure. The wild herd was close, maybe only a valley away, and with the poachers distracted, this might be their only chance. They moved quickly and quietly, leading Willow and Sable up the rocky path. The ascent was slow and tense, every sound magnified: the clatter of loose stones, the soft grunt of effort, the rustle of brush as they navigated the twisting trail. The desert seemed to hold its breath with them. At the top, the land opened suddenly, rolling out in a sunlit sweep of grass and scattered pines. And there, halfway across the open, a band of wild Mustangs grazed in the gold morning light. A striking dun stallion, 3 mares, and 2 yearlings, heads lifting in unison as the newcomers crested the ridge. Eleanor stopped, heart pounding, as Willow raised her own head, nostrils flaring wide, ears trained on the distant herd. For a long moment, everything was still. Then the stallion let out a shrill call, echoing across the valley. Willow answered, voice high and trembling, and Sable stepped forward on unsteady legs, his own call small but clear. The wild herd reacted instantly, the stallion trotting closer, his massive body tense but curious, mane fluttering in the breeze. The mares clustered behind him, watching with wide, dark eyes. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, a silent witness to something primal and ancient unfolding before her. As the stallion approached, Eleanor felt the urge to step between him and Willow, to shield her new companions from the wild unknown, but she held back, trusting instinct over fear. Willow and Sable stood side by side, meeting the stallion's gaze. He circled them, nostrils quivering as he caught their scent, ears flicking as he read every signal. Willow stood tall and unafraid, Sable close to her flank, the foal's thin legs trembling but his head high. Then, in a moment Eleanor would never forget, the stallion stepped close, reached out with his broad nose, and nuzzled Sable, then Willow, a greeting and a welcome. The mares behind him shifted forward, nickering softly, and soon Willow was surrounded by her own kind, embraced in a ring of living history. Eleanor's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, a swirl of pride, relief, and sorrow tangling in her chest. All the nights of fear and exhaustion, the desperate hope, the stubborn refusal to give up, they'd all led to this: the homecoming of a wild soul, the healing of what was broken, the restoration of a family. She watched as Willow and Sable were swept into the band, as the mares greeted the new foal, as Sable pranced, awkward but jubilant, under the approving gaze of his new kin. The stallion turned at last and looked at Eleanor, his gaze deep and knowing. In a gesture so rare it seemed like a dream, he stepped forward and pressed his nose gently against her outstretched hand, the warmth of his breath grounding her in this singular, perfect moment. Gratitude and trust passed between them, wordless, powerful, true. Then, with a toss of his head, the stallion turned back to his family. The band moved off at a slow, deliberate pace, Willow and Sable safe in their midst, disappearing into the wild land that had always been their birthright. Eleanor stood in the hush that followed, awash in bittersweet triumph. Mr. Tucker clapped a hand to her shoulder, silent but proud. The poachers, the storms, the nights of loneliness, all had been overcome. She'd delivered Willow and Sable home, not to her own world, but to the world where they truly belonged. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of fear and doubt. In the valley below, the wild herd galloped, free and unbroken, and Eleanor knew she had done what few could, given life and love and freedom back to the wild. Long after the Mustang herd had vanished into the folds of the wild valley, Eleanor stood at the edge of the ridge, the wind tugging gently at her hair, eyes searching the horizon for one last glimpse of Willow and Sable. Their departure left a hush, a kind of reverent silence that settled around her, broken only by the faint rustle of grass and the distant call of a hawk overhead. The valley stretched away, golden under the weight of the morning sun, and Eleanor let herself linger in that moment, feeling every nuance of pride, ache, and release woven through her chest. She replayed it all in her mind. Willow's cautious trust, Sable's first faltering steps, the constant shadow of danger, and finally, the powerful moment of reunion, the wild stallion's nod of acceptance, the circle of mares that had welcomed Willow and her foal home. Eleanor knew she'd given them what they needed most, even though it meant opening her own heart to loss. It was a lesson the desert had taught her with brutal honesty. Love is fiercest when it lets go. Mr. Tucker broke the silence with a gentle touch on her arm, his presence a steadying anchor. Together, they walked down the slope, their boots stirring dust and stones, retracing the path that had led them to this point. They spoke little. There was no need. The bond between them had grown in the quiet courage of their journey, tested by hardship and sealed in the quiet of shared triumph. Back at the truck, Eleanor took a moment to breathe, her hands resting on the battered tailgate, letting the last threads of adrenaline slip away. She glanced at the empty trailer, remembering how Willow had balked at its confines, how Sable had wobbled on new legs, how every mile had carried them all closer to something they could neither predict nor control. Now the emptiness felt right, a space reclaimed, a promise fulfilled. The drive home was quiet. Mr. Tucker dozed in the passenger seat, his hat tipped low, while Eleanor watched the desert unfurl around them, the land both familiar and somehow changed. The dust of the canyon gave way to the long shadows of mesquite and cactus, the sun arching higher, turning the world brilliant and new. With every passing mile, Eleanor felt the burden of worry slip away, replaced by a lightness she hadn't known in years. At the farmhouse, the routines of daily life awaited. The creak of the porch boards, the scent of coffee brewing, the calls of distant birds. But everything felt different, brighter, more alive. The barn was empty now, save for a few scattered strands of Willow's hair and the marks Sable's hooves had left in the dirt. Eleanor walked through the space, touching the rails, letting memories rise and fade like dust motes in the slanting sunlight. The loneliness that had haunted her after the divorce was gone, replaced by something sturdier, a quiet confidence, a sense of connection not just to the animals she'd saved, but to the land itself. She found herself humming as she swept the barn, smiling at the memory of Sable's wild prance, the determined tilt of Willow's head. Evenings grew softer. She spent long hours on the porch, watching sunsets bleed across the horizon, listening to the wind and the distant thunder that now sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. She caught up on neglected chores, answered messages from friends back in Phoenix, and sent a quiet thank you to the veterinarian whose voice had guided her through so many desperate nights. The farmhouse, once a refuge from the world, became a home again. Not because it kept her isolated, but because it had become the starting point for her own return to herself. Sometimes, late at night, Eleanor dreamed of hooves thundering across open ground, of a wild mane lifted by the wind, of freedom so fierce it made her heart ache. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of grief. They were a testament to all she had gained: strength, purpose, and a belief in her own ability to face what came next. Word of her adventure drifted through town, carried on the easy gossip of the feed store and the cautious pride of neighbors who had doubted whether she would last a single season in the desert. But Eleanor no longer needed their approval. She measured herself by different standards now, by the courage it took to rescue a wild thing, the patience to let it go, and the gratitude she felt for every lesson learned under the sun. As the months slipped by, Eleanor remained attentive to the rhythms of the desert, the shift of wind before a storm, the way light changed across the mesas, the soft hush that lingered in the cool dawn. Sometimes, riding her old bicycle out beyond the farmhouse, she would spot a distant band of Mustangs, dust rising in the gold of late afternoon. She could never be sure, but she liked to believe that one of them was Willow, her coat gleaming, a sturdy colt at her side, both wild and whole. Eleanor's journey had started in brokenness and loneliness, but it had led her to something greater: the understanding that real compassion meant risking the pain of farewell, that true courage grew in the acts of everyday love, and that freedom, once given, returned to the giver 1,000-fold. Standing at the threshold of her barn, watching the sun set over the wild land she now called home, Eleanor smiled, a small, quiet smile, full of gratitude and hope for whatever new beginnings the desert might offer next.